Docu.Drama is another brilliant episode of Frasier. I feel like I need to get a new introduction. I feel like I say the same thing exactly every time, but to be fair, most episodes of Frasier are brilliant, and this one is no exception. This is the 16th episode of Season 8. It's directed by David Lee, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. It's a really solid episode with some great moments. I don't think it will ever be a personal favourite, but certainly I really enjoy it. And it starts off down at KCL. Kenny says that Roz is doing a documentary on space, and Frasier rather passionately says to her, "Roz, it sounds like your documentary could be a portal from which we can glimpse a promise of the future, a promise lit by a billion stars." Roz was actually going to ask Frasier to narrate it before his performance, but she worried that it would be a bit awkward with the role reversal, with Roz being his boss, but he's absolutely fine with it, in theory. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Back at the apartment, Martin is sitting on the sofa while Eddie is in his chair, and Martin's about to enjoy some food when the doorbell goes. He puts the bowl on the table, which I thought felt like a rookie mistake. I was so certain Eddie was going to get up and eat it. It's Niles. Martin asks about the fat farm, which is irritating me a lot, but at the same time, at least we're getting that reminder, so if you tune in on a random episode and you're not entirely caught up, it kind of briefly explains why Daphne's not around. And we then have this contrast between Martin pouring ketchup onto his chili while Niles talks about the arts and literature section. And honestly, while I want to talk about arts and literature, I'm kind of also Team Martin, because there is nothing ketchup can't improve, at least savoury dishes. So I'm kind of in the middle. I want to talk about the arts. I also want to put ketchup on chili. It turns out they're bringing back the Kite Festival, and Niles wants them to enter as they used to do when he was younger. And Martin says that he can't because of his hip, and Niles says, and I love this, he says very beautifully, "Let me be your hip." It was so sweet, and Martin agrees. We then cut to Frasier arriving late for a meeting about this documentary, and we have this well-written discussion, and Frasier isn't really getting with the flow. He has some ideas, but Roz doesn't seem very keen to listen to them, and things get pretty heated. Frasier leaves with the final remark, "The show can bite me." So it's very clear where Frasier stands. Definitely a very powerful way for him to leave the room, and he's still feeling very bitter, because we then cut to KCL. Frasier is on air talking about what it means to be a good leader and knowing when to admit you're wrong. It's very clear Roz is supposed to be listening to this, and we then find out that Roz replaced Frasier with John Glenn, the astronaut, the senator. I don't know that much about John Glenn, but certainly I was aware of the name, and I imagine this would have been a big deal at the time, and it's always pretty interesting when there's a pretty big name as a guest, and for Roz to get John Glenn as well seemed like a pretty big deal. Much more of a big deal than just having Frasier on board. We're then back at the apartment with Martin and Niles, and we see their kite. It looks pretty good, but Martin doesn't want Niles to take the kite outside to practice. Frasier then comes home, starts ranting, and he's clearly very passionate about everything and passionate about being right, and he then refers to John Glenn as a space-age Band-Aid, which I thought was a pretty creative description. And once Frasier walks out of the room and Martin's out of the room, Niles decides that he's going to disobey Martin, and we get a glimpse at what young Niles might have been like when he became excited about something, as he was with this kite. He goes out onto the balcony, and it is very, very windy, too windy for a kite. It's utter chaos. The kite ends up in Martin's window, so needless to say, it's a bit of an issue. We're then with Frasier and John Glenn, and Frasier is talking with him secretively. And then we're at KCL, and the senator shares some ideas, and Frasier realises that Roz's problem is not with Frasier's ideas, it's with Frasier himself. And I think this was apparent earlier on, because Roz did just seem completely unwilling to even listen to Frasier. It's not that she was just instantly dismissive of his ideas, it did seem like she wasn't even really listening to them. And this was reinforced when the senator puts forward some of those ideas of Frasier's, and Frasier realises that Roz accepts them from the senator, from John Glenn, but not from him. And they argue while Senator John Glenn is telling his story, and it was a good way to get the most out of his appearance, out of the character, or the character version of himself, while Roz and Frasier are arguing about things. It was a pretty heated discussion as well, so it was a good way to keep the comedy up, as well as they are having quite a meaningful, slightly heavy conversation, and they make up pretty quickly. and then the senator asks to keep what he has just said between them. Whatever it was he said, we don't actually find out. And whatever he said was so severe, so secretive, that he has to keep the tape. And we then end with Ross and Frasier making up, and the final scene is Niles having to hold up the TV antenna for Martin to watch the television because the kite broke it when he took it out on the balcony. Lesson learned, listen to your father, I guess. So it was a nice, fun way to end things. I think it does raise a meaningful discussion about whether roles could be reversed if you suddenly became your boss's boss. I imagine it would feel awkward for everybody involved, and we get a tiny glimmer of this here, and we also have a great guest appearance from John Glenn. As I said, I'm aware of his name. I feel a little bit more educated now, and I enjoyed it, thoroughly enjoyed it. As I said, probably never going to be a favourite. It doesn't have any specific moment that I thought was fabulous. I guess Niles's excitement over the kite, that very boy-like excitement, spending time bonding with Martin, and then kind of excitedly and nervously going out onto the balcony. Yeah, I'd say Niles was my highlight here, but in general, the whole episode is decent. Docu.Drama is certainly a solid episode of Frasier.